4:12. December 29th, 1944. Eindhoven Airfield is a sheet of wet black glass under a low, choking mist. The kind of morning where sound doesn't travel so much as hang in the air, muffled and hesitant. The twin Merlins of the Mosquito FBCV in Bay 5 cough once, twice, then burst into a throaty, uneven rumble that vibrates across the dispersal strip. Frost shivers off the propeller tips. The smell of dope, glue, and damp plywood mixes with the hot exhaust, creating the unmistakable scent of a wooden war machine waking before dawn. F.O. Raymond Holt sits strapped into the cockpit, helmet damp from the cold, watching the port wing tremble in that familiar way it always has since the airframe was first assembled. Except now the shake is different. Less flutter, more stiffness, as if the wing is bracing against its own past. Down below, partly hidden by fog, Sergeant Lionel Ward stands with his arms folded, chin tucked into his collar, eyes fixed on the exact seam where the fuselage had been damaged and repaired weeks earlier. The other fitters had laughed at the fix: 2 mismatched plywood sheets, a scavenged stiffener strip, and casein glue no one trusted in winter. They called it Ward's Broken-Airframe hack. Ward had pretended not to hear. The radio cracks with static. Sector control relays a radar warning. 2 fast-moving contacts approaching from the northeast, 480 km/h on initial sweep. Only one aircraft fits that profile. Holt feels his stomach tighten. Me-262s. No Mosquito at low altitude could outrun jets. Not this one. Not with a patched belly and a history of vibration issues. Holt's mission, an armed reconnaissance north of the Maas, now looks suicidal before he even lifts off. He inches the throttle forward. The Mosquito rolls, its wooden frame groaning like a ship under strain. At rotation speed, Holt pulls back gently. The aircraft lifts into ground effect, skimming a hand's breadth above the runway, as the fog swirls into vortices around the wingtips. And then something happens, something that should not happen. The patched seam, the ugly line of mismatched ply and glue, catches the airflow differently. Drag collapses. Lift steadies. The nose rises with a fluid confidence the aircraft has never shown. Holt glances at the airspeed indicator. It's climbing faster than any takeoff he's flown in months. Below him, Ward lowers his hand and finally exhales. He knows that feel, that vibration, that note in the engine harmonics. His broken airframe hack isn't groaning for mercy. It's asking for more sky. The Me-262s are coming, and for the first time the Mosquito might actually be able to run. For as long as Holt had flown Mosquitoes, one assumption ruled every briefing room from Norfolk to Eindhoven. The aircraft's strength was altitude, not low-level speed. Every pilot knew the charts. Every intelligence officer repeated the same line. The Mossy outruns by climbing, not by running low. The aircraft's wooden skeleton, light, flexible, brilliant in theory, was said to twist under heavy side loads near the deck. Flex meant drag. Drag meant death when jets entered the fight. It was an article of faith. The Mosquito was a high-altitude sprinter, not a treetop racer. Pilots treated this as gospel. Holt had heard it from instructors, from squadron leaders, even from veterans who had flown the aircraft since its earliest operations. Don't rely on acceleration below 200 feet, they would warn. She's quick, but she breathes down there. She flexes. A flexing airframe stole the one thing a Mosquito needed to survive: instant power transfer. And then there were the jokes, always the jokes. Ward's field repair, the mismatched plywood seam reinforced with a scavenged strip, had become a punchline across 2 dispersal bays. Hold together with violin glue, somebody had said. Another fitter called it a coffin hinge for a coffin plane. Holt had laughed along, if only to mask the quiet dread that he might be flying on borrowed carpentry. Ward never joked back. His paraphrased thought in his notebook that week captured his irritation. A splice is not wood. A splice is geometry. He meant that structure changes airflow. Airflow changes lift. Lift changes survival. But the misconception endured. Airframe flexibility was inevitable, unchangeable, and fatal at low altitude. Jets only needed seconds to overtake a Mosquito running near the ground. And Me-262s didn't need accuracy, just proximity. One burst from their Mk-108 cannons could erase a Mosquito in mid-air. Yet the truth had been hiding in plain sight, buried inside RAF maintenance logs and ignored by pilots who trusted charts more than mechanics. Plywood shortages in late 1944 forced units like Ward's to improvise with stiffer stocks, thicker glue spreads, and bonding techniques that weren't in the manuals. Some airframes became weaker. A few, the lucky few, became stiffer. And stiffness at the wing root didn't just reduce flex, it reduced drag. Down low in cold, dense air, that stiffness translated into acceleration. Within 48 hours of Holt's dawn sortie, that misconception would be dead. Not because a report said so, not because engineers decreed it, but because one Mosquito with an ugly hack in its belly would do what every chart claimed it could not: run from jets and live. The Mosquito was born from a contradiction. The world's most advanced air forces were running out of metal, so Britain built its fastest aircraft out of wood. That decision rewrote industrial logic. De Havilland subcontracted parts not to aircraft factories, but to piano makers, furniture craftsmen, and cabinet shops across Britain. Birch ply from one region, balsa cores from another, glue pressed and cured in workshops that had once built dining sets and church pews. The wooden wonder was a masterpiece, but a masterpiece built from thousands of slightly different hands. Every airframe carried fingerprints of the workshop that shaped it. Humidity during curing changed stiffness. Glue thickness changed vibration patterns. Ply grain direction created micro-variations in how the wing roots flexed at speed. The WWII variant, the low-level fighter bomber, pushed this wooden design to its limit. Twin Merlin 25 engines, two-stage superchargers, and a frame expected to withstand violent yaws at treetop height. British engineers knew the danger. Wooden structures didn't fail like metal. They didn't bend. They delaminated. A seam either held perfectly or came apart all at once. Meanwhile, across Germany, the Me-262 program was collapsing under its own ambition. The Jumo 004 engines were fragile even at altitude. At low level, the turbines inhaled dense, dirty air that spiked heat, warped vanes, and threatened compressor stalls. Jet pilots were warned to avoid sudden throttle changes, avoid sharp turns near the deck, and avoid long pursuits that pushed turbine temps past safe limits. In theory, the Me-262 was unmatched. In practice, it was an exotic thoroughbred forced to race in a swamp. That swamp was exactly where Holt flew. Ward's repair had been born from scarcity, not innovation. A supply delay left Bay 5 without the proper birch ply reinforcement strips needed to fix the fuselage seam after a hard landing cracked the left root. What Ward had were offcuts, two mismatched sheets, one slightly denser than spec, the other cured under colder conditions. He also had a stiffener strip salvaged from a wrecked Mosquito that had burned at the edge of the field. Commanders would have scrapped all of it. Ward saw potential. He trimmed the ply to interlock, applied casein glue thicker than regulations allowed, then clamped it overnight with whatever weight he could scavenge. When the seam cured, it hardened into a geometry the original designers had not intended, a slightly stiffer torsional spine on the port side. To most eyes, it was an ugly patch. To an airframe, it was a new identity. From glue pot to runway, the Mosquito's airflow had changed in ways no manual documented. A flaw had become an advantage. A condemned airframe had become a weapon tuned for low-level sprinting, precisely where jets faltered. In factory terms, it was impossible. In wartime terms, it was inevitable. When engineers talk about speed, they rarely mean the number pilots brag about in bars. They mean the hidden numbers: drag coefficients, torsional oscillation rates, flutter frequencies, spool-up delays, and the murderous arithmetic of airflow density. Holt's Mosquito lived inside those numbers, and Ward's strange repair, dismissed as a joke, shifted them just enough to change the outcome of a chase no mosquito should have survived. Start with the brochure figures, the ones that built the myth. A stock Mosquito FB could make 366 mph at sea level, maybe 380 in perfect atmospheric conditions with clean paint, smooth skins, and both Merlins singing. The Me-262, by contrast, boasted 540-560 mph. On paper, that made pursuit a formality. The jet only needed seconds to close the gap. But numbers end illusions. The Jumo 004 turbine at low altitude required 308 seconds to spool from cruise to full thrust. That delay didn't matter in shallow dives at 20,000 feet. It mattered below 300 feet, where a Mosquito could gain 15 to 20 miles from Hiroshima in the same window simply by dropping into ground effect. And this Mosquito, Ward's patched, mocked field-modified airframe, gained even more. The secret was stiffness. Plywood doesn't bend uniformly. When the wing root flexes, it increases drag, sometimes by as much as 4 to 6% in sharp maneuvers. Ward's reinforcement changed that equation. His mismatched birch sheets and overthick glue spread reduced micro-flutter along the port route by an estimated 9 to 14% at high RPM. That meant cleaner airflow, less vibration bleeding into the fuselage, and a reduction in induced drag right where the Mosquito usually suffered most. Then came the second number, air density. Cold morning air over farmland is thick enough to punish jets. The Me-262's intakes gulped that dense mass, raising turbine temperatures and increasing the risk of blade warp. To compensate, pilots throttled more cautiously near the deck, further lengthening spool-up times. Meanwhile, the Mosquito's Merlins thrived in cold air. Denser oxygen means more punch per revolution. Holt wasn't just flying. He was riding a natural supercharger delivered by the weather itself. Third number, ground effect. At 2 wingspans above the Earth, roughly 15 to 20 feet, the Mosquito could gain effective speed without adding raw engine output. Lift increased, drag fell. For a wooden airframe, this was dangerous. Too much flex could induce wobble. But Ward's reinforced seam eliminated exactly that wobble. What should have been instability became stability, and stability became acceleration. In that shallow cushion above the fields, Holt's aircraft briefly pushed into the 400-plus mph band. Not sustained, not recorded in any official test, but real enough to matter. The Me-262s behind him? They were still waiting for turbines to spool, bleeding energy in the thicker air, and burning fuel they could not afford to waste. Not superior engines, not superior design, not a better aircraft. Just a single structural hack that shifted the math of destruction for 30 irreplaceable seconds and left jets behind in a cloud of cold morning dust. 2 days before the dawn chase, the airfield was drowning in crosswinds. A December gale swept over Eindhoven, slapping canvas hangar doors and bending saplings nearly to the ground. The sky hung low and sickly, the kind of gray that swallowed depth perception and made even experienced pilots feel like beginners again. Ward stood beside the patched Mosquito with his hands jammed deep in his pockets, watching Holt tighten his harness for what was officially a post-repair verification flight and unofficially a gamble with the aircraft's structural soul. Holt powered up the Merlins. The left engine rattled, then steadied. The right coughed through a moment of uneven airflow before settling into a smooth thrum. Yet even at idle, Holt felt something new. The usual low-frequency vibration, the one that had haunted the aircraft since its hard landing, was gone. In its place was a firmer, tighter hum, the airframe resonating through the seat with a confidence it had never shown. Ward logged the change silently. Holt eased the throttle forward. The Mosquito began its roll, tail lifting reluctantly against the gusting wind. At 60 knots, the starboard wing lifted too quickly. Holt corrected, but the plane responded sharper than expected, almost too sharp. That should have been the first warning. Instead, Holt read it as eagerness. He pulled back. The Mosquito leapt into the air, climbing through uneven pockets of turbulence. At 200 feet, the rough air hit hard. Gusts shoved the aircraft sideways. Buffeting hammered the wings. Normally, this was where the Mosquito's flexible frame complained. Creaks, groans, the unsettling sensation of the wingtips lagging half a beat behind the fuselage. But not today. Holt rolled left, then right, testing responsiveness. The aircraft moved like a single carved piece, not laminated sections. The flutter at the wing root, always mild but always present, had vanished entirely. He keyed the radio. "Ward, are you copying? The port route feels locked. In a good way." Ward exhaled through the transmitter. "That's what I hoped." An understatement. Ward had never hoped. He had calculated, he had improvised. Now he was being vindicated by cold air and hard physics. From the tower came a cautious warning. "Be advised, airframe stress above recommended limits in turbulence." Only someone who had never flown a Mosquito would say such a thing. Holt leveled out and spotted a pair of Typhoons a few miles east, conducting their own test hop. He requested a mock chase. The tower hesitated. It wasn't protocol, and protocol mattered in peacetime. This wasn't peacetime. They approved. The Typhoons formed on his tail, closed in, then waited for Holt to accelerate. He pushed the throttle halfway. The Mosquito surged. RPM climbed, airspeed climbed, and the gap behind him widened much faster than the Typhoon pilots expected. Holt grinned. He pushed harder. Wore emergency power for 3 seconds. The aircraft didn't shudder. It didn't twist. Instead, it leaped ahead as if someone had cut loose a dragging anchor. The Typhoons radioed, "What are you doing over there? We can't hold." Holt almost laughed. He banked through a fast S-turn, and the Mosquito held shape like a steel-framed fighter. It was wrong. It was beautiful. Ward watched from the ground, counting seconds, memorizing engine tone, knowing full well this was no ordinary repair. He scribbled a paraphrased line into his notebook minutes later. Vibration gone. Response immediate. Structural gain unintentional, but undeniable. The Franken-frame held at every limit Holt pushed. It wasn't designed for this. It simply refused to fail. And that refusal would soon matter more than any manual ever written. By late 1944, the Me-262 looked untouchable in propaganda films and intelligence briefs. Sleek, silver, and impossibly fast, it was held up as proof that Germany could still bend the future to its will. But the numbers beneath the surface, those brittle, unforgiving numbers, told a different story. Every jet in the Luftwaffe lived on borrowed minutes, not hours. Each sortie pulled the turbines closer to catastrophic failure, and every low-altitude chase devoured the narrow margins, keeping those engines alive. The Jumo 004 turbine was a masterpiece crippled by reality. Its internal blades were designed for alloys Germany could no longer produce. Shortages forced factories to use steel blends that softened under heat. At combat power near the deck, turbine temperature spiked so quickly that pilots were instructed to avoid abrupt throttle changes entirely. Even a moment of impatience could warp a vane, trigger a compressor surge, or send fragments of metal through the jet like shrapnel. Spool-up lag, 3 to 8 full seconds, was not a quirk. It was a survival tax. Fuel was its own form of defeat. Late-war synthetic batches varied in quality, octane swinging unpredictably from day to day. Pilots joked, half-seriously, that they could tell how the night's bombing went by how their engine responded at takeoff. A cautious throttle meant bomber crews had found their mark. A sputtering climb meant somebody's refinery had vanished in fire. Meanwhile, Mosquitoes flew on the opposite logic. Reliability over revolution. Their Merlins thrived in dense, cold air. Their wooden frames resisted sudden stress in ways metal didn't. And at low altitude, where physics punished jets and rewarded props, a Mosquito could bank harder, accelerate sooner, and maintain airflow that turbines struggled to breathe. One Luftwaffe jet mechanic, quoted decades later, summarized it with grim clarity. Paraphrased here. The jets were lions, but sick ones. They had to kill quickly or die in the chase. The Me-262 pair stalking Holt that morning had engines logged at 11 and 16 operational hours. That meant one thing. Both turbines were overdue for inspection. Both were already running hotter than they should. Both pilots knew their machines were balancing on the thin edge between thrust and sudden death. So when Holt dropped into ground effect and his patched Mosquito launched forward like a wooden spear, the jets behind him faced the math their pilots prayed to avoid. Push harder, and the turbines might tear themselves apart. Hold back, and the quarry escapes. In a war where engineering brilliance was collapsing under industrial starvation, the Me-262s were no longer predators. They were fragile machines chasing a wooden aircraft that refused to obey the limits written on its blueprints. The first warning Holt receives is not from his instruments nor from ground control. It is from the landscape itself. The treetops ahead flicker with reflected light, brief flashes like metal catching the dawn. Holt's instincts tighten. The Me-262s are descending behind him, using altitude to build the speed they cannot summon at low level. He pushes the throttle to the gate. The Mosquito levels at barely 30 feet, a gray apparition racing along the Dutch farmland. The Merlins howl. The patched airframe hums like a tightened drum. Wind shear claws at the twin tails, but Holt holds steady, letting the ground effect wrap around the aircraft like a cushion of compressed air. At this height, the Mosquito becomes a paradox, lighter, quicker, and somehow more stable than the designers expected. Behind him, the jets close in. The first Me-262 drops into position and lines up the shot. Holt sees the silhouette growing in his mirror, the swept wings carving arcs through the morning haze. Any other Mosquito would be dead in seconds. But when Holt jinks left at high speed, something astonishing happens. The airframe doesn't flex. It pivots, clean, sharp, instant. The jet overshoots. The Me-262 pilot reacts too late. He pulls back, tries to correct, and his turbines gulp a pocket of dense, disturbed air. A brief orange flash blinks from his exhaust. Holt recognizes the sign, a compressor burp. The jet wobbles, its nose seesawing as the turbines struggle to regain balance. By the time the pilot steadies his aircraft, Holt has already widened the gap by 100 yards. Holt dips lower, following a ribbon of water, a narrow drainage canal glinting under the newborn light. The Mosquito's shadow skims the surface, distorted and trembling. Ward's reinforced seam holds as the fuselage cuts through the turbulent air, the port wing refusing to flex in ways that would normally bleed speed. Every foot lower Holt flies, the stronger the ground effect lift becomes. He is no longer flying away from the jets. He is flying under the physics that limit them. The second Me-262 dives aggressively, trying to trap him between the canal and its guns. Holt rolls right, then snaps left around a line of winter-bare trees. Jets hate this maneuver. Their wide turn radius stretches into football field arcs. Holt watches over his shoulder as the Me-262 tries to follow, and fails, sliding wide as turbulence chews into its speed. Speed advantage means nothing if a machine cannot turn without dying. The first jet reappears on the left, lower this time, committing to the pursuit. Holt can almost feel the pilot's frustration. Why isn't the Mosquito slowing? Why isn't the airframe flexing? Why does a supposedly fragile wooden bomber behave like a knife slicing through dense air? Holt pulls into a shallow rise just before a village boundary. Chimneys and church spires glide beneath him by mere meters. The Mosquito holds, the airflow clinging to its wings in a perfect unnatural sheet. The jets fall behind again, each second widening the gap in a way no briefing ever prepared Holt to witness. In just 90 seconds, the chase has turned from mathematics to disbelief, jets struggling to tame the air, and a wooden aircraft exploiting it with predatory grace. The chase enters its decisive phase as Holt clears the village and drops back to a terrifying height, so low that the prop wash ripples puddles in the frozen fields. The morning fog, torn into ribbons by the Mosquito's slipstream, clings to the fuselage before peeling away in long white threads. Holt feels the aircraft settle into the dense cushion of air just above the ground. Ground effect deepens, lift increases, drag falls away, and the patched fuselage seam, Ward's ugly, mocked, ridiculed hack, locks the airframe into a stiffness that shouldn't exist on a wooden aircraft. Behind him, the two Me-262s dive again, committing to a chase that their turbines were never designed for. At this altitude, their intakes swallow cold, heavy air. Temperatures spike. The needle on each pilot's engine gauge creeps toward red. They need to throttle back. But if they throttle back, the Mosquito disappears. Holt banks right, kissing the earth so closely that his port wingtip seems to slice the tops off the winter grass. The Mosquito responds instantly. One motion, one rhythm. No lag, no flex. This is where a typical Mosquito would flutter, where the plywood would breathe and steal away acceleration. But Ward's reinforced root seams do the opposite. They channel airflow cleanly along the fuselage, cutting micro-drag and turning a desperate evasion into a controlled sprint. The first jet tries to follow. It cannot. Its wide turn radius balloons outward, losing hundreds of yards in the span of seconds. The pilot pushes harder. A roar, a flash of orange, and the turbine belches smoke. Overheat warning. He brakes left, forced to abandon the pursuit before his engine tears itself apart. Holt doesn't see the jet peel off. He only hears the thin shift in acoustics, a faint reduction in pressure, the sound of a predator leaving the hunt. He pushes the throttles forward one last inch. The Merlins surge. RPM spikes. The airspeed indicator ticks toward numbers he didn't trust during testing and still doesn't trust now. The second Me-262, the last hunter in the sky, claws after him. But now the math is against it. Its fuel load is bleeding down, its turbines are running too hot, its thin wings tremble as the pilot tries to drag the jet into a tighter pursuit arc. Holt senses the hesitation, the wobble. The jet is reaching its structural limit. He aims the Mosquito into a broad, rising curve toward the east. The sun crests the horizon, a blinding sheet of gold washing across his canopy. Behind him, the jet enters the glare, canopy flooding with light. Holt doesn't need to look to know he's winning. He feels it in the vibrations, in the tightened airframe, in the absence of flex, in the way the Mosquito holds speed like a clenched fist refusing to let go. The Me-262 finally yields. Its pilot makes the only rational choice: survival. He throttles back, turning away, turbines coughing as they cool. The jet's silver fuselage shrinks into the haze, beaten not by higher technology nor by superior firepower, but by a wooden aircraft repaired with mismatched plywood and a fitter's stubborn refusal to accept failure. Holt levels off into the sun, breath shaking with adrenaline. For the first time since takeoff, he realizes something monumental has happened. He hasn't escaped jets. He has dusted them. When Holt brought the Mosquito back over Eindhoven, the airfield was still half asleep, a smear of hangars and dispersal bays wrapped in fog. He throttled back, let the Merlins settle into their metallic purr, and eased the aircraft onto the strip with a softness that belied the violence of the chase he had just survived. The moment the wheels touched down, he felt the vibration again. The tight, disciplined hum of an airframe that had stopped behaving like plywood and started behaving like steel. Ground crew swarmed toward him. Some jogged. Some walked as if afraid to break the illusion. Jets did not fail to catch Mosquitoes. That simply wasn't how the war worked. But Ward had heard the Merlin's pitch long before the aircraft appeared, and he was already moving toward Bay 5 with a rag in his hand, eyes narrowed, jaw set. Holt shut down the engines. The propellers wound down with the same steady rhythm they had shown in flight. Not a rattle, not a flutter. He climbed down the ladder, boots still trembling, heart still hammering from the knowledge that physics itself had bent in his favor. The first words from the nearest fitter weren't congratulations. They were disbelief. How fast did she go? Holt didn't know. The airspeed indicator had been brushing the limits of its arc. But he described what he felt: the absence of flex, the unnatural stability. the way the aircraft dug into the air instead of shuddering through it. Ward listened without blinking. Ward placed his palm on the patched seam along the port route. To everyone else, it looked like a scar. Two mismatched ply sheets, glue squeezed out in uneven lines, a salvaged stiffener strip hiding beneath a layer of hastily brushed paint. But Ward understood the truth immediately. He had built not a repair, but a new geometry, one that altered airflow just enough to change the outcome of a gunless duel against machines decades ahead in design. The official squadron log would later reduce the event to 3 sentences. Enemy jets sighted. Evasive maneuver successful. Aircraft returned undamaged. Numbers without meaning. But the reality was a coffin nail hammered into the myth of jet invincibility. The Me-262s didn't lose because the Mosquito was faster. They lost because their technology was fragile. Their engines starved for metallurgical precision, and their pilots were chained to turbines that punished every mistake. Holt's wooden aircraft, patched, mocked, nearly scrapped, survived because it was resilient, not revolutionary. Not design elegance, but adaptability. Not cutting-edge engineering, but the stubborn physics of reinforced timber. Not speed, but survivability. Ward traced the seam one last time, hearing it creak softly, like a violin string finding pitch. That tiny note had saved a life, and it had left jets behind in the dust. If you've stayed with Holt skimming the fields at treetop height, if you've felt the turbines behind him surge, stumble, and fall away, you've just witnessed a truth the war tried to bury under charts and doctrine. Machines don't win because of what the manuals say. They win because of what they refuse to do. Refuse to break. Refuse to flex. Refuse to accept the limits stamped on their blueprints. Holt's Mosquito didn't outrun jets through speed. It outlasted them through structure, through a fitter's hands, a patch of mismatched plywood, and a seam that turned physics into an ally. These stories survive because you keep them alive. Every like pushes the algorithm to carry another forgotten moment out of its hangar. Every comment adds one more voice saying these men mattered. And every subscription tells the platform that craftsmanship, engineering, and courage still have a place in a world drowning in noise. If you want more, if you want the next strange machine, the next improbable fix that shouldn't have worked but changed the battle anyway, stay with us. Because next time we're going somewhere darker, heavier, louder.